Gaming on a Mac. That's like taboo, right? Like that's not something you're supposed to be doing, but funnily enough, I remember as a kid playing games on a Mac. I remember playing Oregon Trail and some really crappy port of Doom on old Macs running Mac OS 8 and 9. And even later on, I remember playing things like Spore and Wall-E on our 2008 MacBook. But nowadays, it's just seen as a joke. Why? Well, today I'm going to try to answer that question, and I'm also going to try to do what is the hot new thing for gaming consoles and gaming PCs, which is 4K gaming. But I'm going to be doing it with my 24-core M1 Max Mac Studio. So let's get started. First things first, with Apple's transition to the ARM platform of Apple Silicon, there's obviously been a lot of things changing on the Apple side. Clearly, we've got smaller Macs that don't draw nearly as much power and are dead silent during full speed operations. And even with the laptops having slightly more audible fans, the battery life due to the efficiency of these machines is insane. But we don't see Apple advertising gaming, which is funny because they also used to advertise gaming on some of their older Macs. Just go to the Internet Archive and look up some stuff like that. You can see their graphics talking about gaming. Pretty wild. But why is that? Is it because Apple's performance in the graphics department is not there? Is it because the graphics cards are so weak compared to newer systems that the only reason these Macs can thrive the way they do is because Apple's overly optimizing these to overcome the poor graphical performance? No, actually, that's not the case at all. If we look at a performance metric like teraflops for the raw graphical performance of the 24-core GPU in the M1 Max, we see that it comes in at 7.8 teraflops, which is actually more than something like NVIDIA's RTX 2070, pulling in 7.4 teraflops. So clearly, graphical performance is not as big of an issue, at least in terms of the raw numbers. I mean, hell, if the Xbox Series S only has 4 teraflops and it's doing 60 FPS 1440p gaming and some games even running at 4K on it, why can't the Mac Studio? Makes no sense. Well, for anybody in the tech community who has two brain cells to rub together, you can probably piece together that the numbers aren't everything. There are so many more things to keep in mind when it comes to how something performs on hardware. Like, I just threw the RTX 2070 under the bus for being less powerful than the Mac Studio, the lower-end Mac Studio, but the Mac Studio doesn't have things like RT cores for ray tracing, or a PhysX engine, or NVENC encoding. There are things that NVIDIA does for their cards where, even though it is technically less powerful in raw GPU performance, it has other benefits. Software is everything, especially on the Mac, and as I mentioned before, these things have the power to play games, and if you load up something like a game on Apple Arcade, it can handle it really well, especially games that are already made to be native on Apple Silicon. And on a personal note, whenever I'm killing time over at my computer workstation, I will actually play something like Kerbal Space Program or Minecraft, and because those games are rather simple, even though they are not made for Apple Silicon, translating them to something that can run on this computer through Rosetta is so good that it really doesn't even feel like I'm playing through a translation layer. The games load quickly, play well, it's pretty impressive. So just right there, yes, you can play games on a Mac, but I wanted to push it. So how does it do with 4K gaming, and what games am I going to play in 4K on this Mac? Well, my main computer setup has two 1440p monitors, so obviously that wasn't going to be enough. So I hooked it up to my TV behind me here, and I decided to download a handful of games off my Steam library, and that's where we ran into the first issue. The first issue I ran into was the fact that, well, there aren't a lot of games in my library that are demanding enough and also compatible with Apple. There used to be more, but because Apple dropped the support for 32-bit apps, games like XCOM and Portal just don't work anymore. So the games that I ended up choosing were older, but still rather demanding, which was Batman Arkham City, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Shadows of Mordor, and Kerbal Space Program. I was also going to try Car Mechanic Simulator 2018, but no matter how many times I tried to open it, it just kept crashing. I'm not sure why. Again, this is an issue where I feel like software is really letting down the Mac in terms of the gaming experience. Also, yes, I'm filming from the side looking at the TV screen. I apologize. Nothing played correctly when I was doing screen recording, so I just stopped doing the screen recording on the Mac and just pointed my camera at the TV. It's kind of ghetto, but it is what it is. So I started out with Arkham City, and I ran the benchmark after maxing out all of the settings to their highest rating and putting the screen resolution at full 4K. And, well, it played at a locked 60 FPS, only dipping frames during transitions in the benchmark. That's a really good start. Even once I dropped into the city and started fighting enemies, all these enemies surrounding me with a bunch of different things going on at once, it never dropped a frame. I was genuinely impressed. I even went into Activity Monitor to see if it was already made for Apple Silicon, and no, it's being translated, and it was locked at 60 FPS, all ultra settings, all 4K. Wow, that's pretty good. Now, of course, Arkham City is quite an older game. I remember playing this on the Xbox 360, so that'll give you an idea of how old it is. So it's not surprising that even bumping up everything to 4K and Ultra isn't too demanding for a system like this. So we're going to move on to Rise of the Tomb Raider. So in Rise of the Tomb Raider, I actually ran into something that I wasn't anticipating, which was the hair physics really messing with the frame rate. First time I ran the test, it was down into the 20s and below, and the hair physics looked terrible. And this is because the hair physics, specifically for this game, are based around Tress effects, which is something that AMD cards can handle really well, but most other cards can usually be pretty heavily affected by. But once I turned Tress effects off, the frame rate went straight up to 40 to 50 FPS. It was still below 60, but I was still getting playable frame rates by most accounts. Especially considering that a lot of consoles that played this back in the day would usually get 30 FPS or so. So I would say 40 is not too bad. But of course, that's just in the benchmarks. How is it when you actually play the game? Well, again, it wasn't that bad. I found no issues playing the game. It was completely reasonable. Of course, I was mainly in the cave, but a lot of these cave opening sections have a lot of physics objects, a lot of moving bits, fire effects, lighting effects, and it had no issues. I was at least expecting stuttering because, again, even with this running at a lower FPS, we're also dealing with a translation layer. So I was fully anticipating this really struggling, and no, turn off Tress effects and leave everything else on high and you're golden. That means so far these games have been pretty good on this computer, especially considering they're running at 4K. And keep in mind, while playing these games, the fans on this computer are silent. And I forgot to mention something. I was able to connect up my controller with no issues. It just paired up over Bluetooth like it was any other device. I was actually more surprised by that than the game's launching, to be honest. I guess it's not much of a surprise considering you can do it with the iPad, but still, like, just put it in pairing mode and go into your Bluetooth settings and there's your Xbox controller. Boom, done. Anyway, these games are performing surprisingly well, and while 40 to 50 FPS isn't a locked 60 at 4K, you gotta keep in mind it's still at 4K. That, for me, was very impressive. But now we move on to Shadows of Mordor. This game's performance is terrible. It's really bad. And it's not just because the frame rate gets low. It gets very low, yes, but it gets so inconsistent that even outside of the benchmark, just playing the actual game, it is borderline unplayable. And funnily enough, for the benchmark, I tried the lowest settings and I tried Ultra. I basically tried the two extremes, and it was just as inconsistent on both of them, never cresting above 40 FPS and dropping sometimes as low as 10 FPS. Now, from what I remember with this game, it was both GPU and CPU intensive, and my theory is that because the CPU and GPU are both struggling to play this game, they're both fighting over bandwidth for the memory, and potentially that is where our bottleneck is, because the GPU and CPU both share the same RAM, which is why you see such fast RAM speeds for these computers, because graphics cards need fast memory, and the faster the memory is for something like the CPU, that's just a bonus. But when you're saturating CPU and GPU, and they're both pulling for memory at the same time, that could potentially be a bottleneck, and I feel like that's what we're seeing here. It's kind of unfortunate because my first thought was that this game could play just fine on something like an Xbox One, but then I also remembered that the settings, at least the graphical equivalents on the Xbox One, were extremely low, and again, we're running through a translation layer, and I feel like this is the first instance where we've seen the translation layer or the memory bandwidth becoming a point of being an issue. So there you go, the first game that couldn't hack it on the Mac Studio. It's a newer game, and again, I remember it being a pretty demanding game to play back in the day, but yeah, you're not playing this game on the Mac Studio unless they optimize it for the ARM architecture, which I don't see them doing. So lastly, I played Kerbal Space Program because I've played this before on my computer and I just wanted to see what it was like in 4K. I left all the settings the same as it is on 1440p, which is to say maxed out, and I set it up to 4K, and it's fine. It plays well, it's fun, and it felt like it was locked in at 60 FPS. I looked around at different parts of the environment. I loaded in very, very complex models, and initially upon loading in some models, they would stutter, but once every asset was loaded in, it was buttery smooth. So that's 3 out of 4 games that play reasonably well on this computer, but this kind of raises the question again, why don't people game on a Mac? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Number one, Macs just aren't for that market, and most people who want to play a game on a Mac are either buying an older Intel Mac and loading it into Boot Camp to play the games because then you just have a Windows instance, or they're just playing a game to sort of scratch the itch of, oh, I want to play a game real quick while I'm waiting for something else to finish what it's doing. You're never really buying a Mac to specifically game. They're just not targeted at that market. And secondly, which ties into the first thing, because they're not targeted to that market, game developers just don't have an incentive to make a game for the Mac unless they're Apple Arcade game developers, where they are making something specifically for Apple's arcade service. 9 times out of 10, if you're going to go to talk to somebody like CD Projekt Red or Treyarch or any of these big game companies, they just have no incentive to make games for a Mac. So the software isn't there and isn't optimized. And for the ones that are, they've been translated for a while now, and they're older games, and with Apple moving to Apple Silicon, the performance is there, but the incentive to take advantage of the performance isn't. However, this performance does bring advantages for things other than gaming. This is why companies that make professional software have more of an incentive to optimize for the Mac, because companies like Adobe or even Apple with their own software like Final Cut and Logic take advantage of this significantly more powerful hardware to basically bury the competition when it comes to export times, 3D modeling and render times. All that kind of stuff is where Apple thrives. Work and creativity on a different, totally different market than what gamers are looking for. So at the end of the day, if you're really looking to 4K game on a workstation, you're better off buying a PC workstation that has the hardware that can also do gaming instead of buying a Mac workstation with the raw compute performance for gaming and none of the optimization. And I know I'm not really telling you anything that you probably didn't already know, but for those of you curious, if you have Rise of the Tomb Raider, I get those names confused. If you have Rise of the Tomb Raider, that's the right one, Arkham City, Kerbal Space Program, or Minecraft, yeah, you can game. And if you have the first 3 I mentioned, yeah, you can 4K game, and it sits there silently, and it will accept an Xbox controller and just play. But for most people, if you're looking to play a massive game library that has a ton of options, a huge amount of games coming out currently, and will continue to get a massive amount of games coming out in the future, maybe just stick to your RGB Rainbow Party gaming PC. Either way, thank you guys for watching this video and sitting through my rant about why 4K gaming on the Mac is not a good idea. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something from it. If you did, make sure to subscribe. I've got a lot more stuff coming out about these computers. I also have a full review, hopefully coming out in the next few weeks, about the Mac Studio and how it's been in my workflow. Aside from that, leave a comment letting me know what you guys think. Do you think that it's stupid that I tried to game on it? Of course you do. You have a brain. Or do you think that it's something that you may want to try in the future? Because you are weird like me. Either way, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.